Hi, everyone. I'm Salil, working for Facebook. Happy to be here, representing the Telecom Infra project. So I wanted to kick this off with just a few questions. How many of you have ever been at Mobile World Congress in Barcelona? How many attended in 2019? Does anybody remember the most obvious abbreviation that was at MWC in Barcelona? It was plastered all over the place. 5G. Right? So if you think about the promise of 5G, right, apart from all the stuff that you hear about high bandwidth, low latency, stuff that is in every single presentation, the reality is service providers are really looking for new opportunities to get revenue, and at the same time really looking to identify how they can lower the cost of operating these networks, right? And so the whole idea of TCO savings is really crucial to every operator. And how do you achieve that goal? You achieve that goal through applying principles of SDN, applying the principles of virtualization, and ultimately trying to automate these networks, right? So that you can fundamentally reduce the operational cost of these networks. In order to really do that, the fundamental idea is try to embrace open architectures, right? Actually embracing open architectures, driving flexibility, creating a diverse supply chain, all of that is necessary for operators to really get the true benefits of 5G. So that leads me to the real focus of my presentation, that is the Telecom Infra project, right? The Telecom Infra project was fundamentally created with the idea of bringing the community together, really trying to transform the way the telecom infrastructure is actually built, architected, validated, and ultimately deployed. And this is not a trivial task. We actually need the whole community to work together so that every company, infrastructure vendor, SI is not working in its own silo, but is actually working together to actually pool together resources so that we can work much faster, much more efficiently. And the key tenets of Telecom Infra project were really trying to make sure that we reinvent how you build and architect this infrastructure. How do you make sure that you look at all the different business models that are needed to support the introduction of this hardware and software into the industry, and ultimately make sure that there's rapid innovation. There are new startups able to come into that ecosystem and that you can support them. And so when TIP was established, we had 3 different approaches. We wanted to create project groups where the different partners in the ecosystem can work together and actually build new products. We created community labs where you could work together to actually validate these products and create a pathway to commercialization. And last, we created something called the TEACs, which are the TIP Ecosystem Acceleration Centers, where you can support startups, bring together the venture capitalists that can actually help fund them, along with the operators who are crucial to really make sure there's a path to actual deployment for all of these startups working on innovative technology. So that's kind of the 3 areas of emphasis for TIP, and that's how it was actually established. Why does TIP actually exist, right? If you think about the classic scissor effect that you probably heard in other presentations as well, right? You really see a situation where data consumption just continues to increase exponentially, and at the same time you see ARPUs continuing to decrease, right? Every single operator in different parts of the globe is facing that challenge. It's to different degrees, depending on which market you're in. There are some markets where it's pretty severe, and some markets where it's not as bad. But the reality is everybody's facing that. At the same time, the number of devices that you have on these networks is actually growing at an exponential pace, right? So it's not just data volume that's increasing, but actual numbers of devices that are increasing. And if you think about the world's population, right, there's only about 50% of the world's population that's actually connected to the internet. And how do you actually get the rest of that world's population that has not been connected so far? And there are reasons for that, because it's not economically viable. The current approaches that have been taken are not sustainable, so therefore these folks aren't connected. How can you actually ultimately bring them onto the internet? And that's really the fundamental reason why there's a focus in TIP to really bring better quality networks, which are cost effective, and ultimately improve the quality of service for people and make sure that the internet is accessible to all, right? So these are the fundamental tenets of why TIP is in existence. It's important to understand that TIP is not only focused on one specific area, right? For example, TIP is really focused on really bringing together solutions for all different segments. And this spans ultra-rural all the way through dense urban. And there are solutions that are in TIP that can be focused on ultra-rural. We have solutions like Open Cellular that are really focused on connecting the ultra-rural communities to solutions that are focused on dense urban areas, right? Whether it's our optical solutions that are focused on bringing high bandwidth connectivity, cell-side gateways, things of that nature. Whether it's solutions for rural, whether there are solutions like Open RAN that can be supporting 2G, 3G, 4G technologies and can work in both rural as well as suburban. The idea is to make sure that there's a whole bunch of technologies in this toolkit that can serve a diverse set of communities. Right? And that's very, very important for us to get across, that TIP is not focused on just one segment of the actual deployment landscape. If you think about the journey for TIP, TIP was launched in 2016 with essentially 30 member companies. The founding member companies included Deutsche Telekom, Intel, Nokia, SKT, and Facebook. And when TIP was established, we, at the outset, set up 3 different areas of focus: access, backhaul, core, and management. These were the 3 areas that we felt were really important to establish at the outset, and then create project groups that really fit into each one of these 3 buckets. Moving to 2017, we actually had the first set of actual trials kick off, and some of these were focused on virtualized RAN fronthaul, one of the programs that is actually incubated through TIP. We had the first set of TIP community labs set up. These community labs are set up by operators in different parts of the globe, specific use cases that are being defined by them, specific solutions that have been defined by the operators, and then technology partners coming together to integrate, validate, and ultimately create a path to commercialization. And at the same time, we created the TIP Ecosystem Acceleration Center concept, and we actually started incubating that with some of the key operator partners. Moving to 2018 is when we had a couple of additional tier 1 partners come on board from the operator community. We had BT, Vodafone, Telefonica join the board of directors. We had a bunch of operator-led RFIs get issued, and these were very, very important and impactful for the industry because TIP was focused on building the reference designs, starting to define the specifications, and then operators taking those as a reference point and saying, well, we want to take some of these things that have been developed within TIP and create a path to actually saying, vendors, we need you to actually build hardware that can meet these requirements, right? Meet these specifications. And so that journey began in 2018. We had a couple of key important tier 1s, such as Vodafone and Telefonica actually issuing RFIs. I'll talk about that a little bit later in this talk. Thereafter, we had trial deployments kicking off. Some of the work that we did in the millimeter wave networks project group with Deutsche Telekom as actually the chair, they actually kicked off some early trials. These led to deployment trials in Hungary, and thereafter they're actually expanding them to other parts as well. And we actually reached 500 member companies within the TIP community. So 2018 was a really important year. Moving to 2019, at Mobile World Congress, we actually had the first end-to-end demonstration. And the reason this was really important for TIP was to make sure that all of the different solutions that were built through the access, backhaul, and core and management spaces were not viewed as individual components, but actually can be integrated, and we can actually deliver a complete network. And that's important for operators to understand that TIP was not just building point solutions, but actually building a complete network and can validate the interoperability between all these different components. And that's why this showcase was really crucial. It was actually attended by more than 300 different operator partners from across the globe. We had 16 different vendor partners part of this. So it was a really big initiative that we landed at MWC. At the same time, the operators that actually issued the RFIs in 2018 took it one step further and kicked off Open RAN field trials. And these field trials are important because it gave signal to the industry that, hey, we're not just doing RFIs for the sake of doing RFIs. There are a lot of operators that issue RFIs in the globe, but actually taking this to field trial to give confidence to our operational teams that we can ultimately take this technology and deploy it at scale. And at the same time, we had partners doing tech prototypes. Disaggregated cell-side gateway, one of the key components of the work out of our open optical packet transport group, actually was defined. We had hardware partners develop prototypes that were showcased at the same time frame. So that's kind of a pivotal journey of over the 3.5 years. If you think about the member companies, there are more than 500 member companies within TIP. So really diverse group of partners includes operators, system integrators, component partners, web scale companies, and most importantly, the operator community. Right? So it's a really vibrant community that's working together to really build solutions and really architect them to meet the needs of the industry. Diverse representation is a really important thing that I want to highlight. It's not just diverse in the sense of types of companies, but it's diverse in terms of actually being represented across the globe, right? And the important thing to think about is global representation is crucial because every market has its own needs. If you think about the TIP Summit that we had in 2018, we had people visiting from 60 different countries. So it was actually diverse from a global perspective. Really important to get that input, because tailoring solutions for different markets is crucial. Otherwise, adoption can be challenging. If you think about the vision for global deployments, that's important. We are not focused on just deploying stuff in a certain part of the globe. It's not just about focusing on Asia or North America. We really want to make sure that this technology has inputs from across the globe, but also gets deployed everywhere. That's important. And then the aspect of regional stakeholder alignment is crucial. We invest a lot through the TIP initiatives to make sure that we have workshops in different regions. So while we have conference calls and ways and means for people to communicate and share information, we also have regional workshops. And that's important to connect with people in different parts of the globe. So whether it's having workshops in Asia, having workshops in Germany, in the European space, and then having workshops in Latin America, these have been actually prioritized and is a good way to get the community together to actually interact and identify where are the synergies and how can we build solutions faster. If you think about the community, we break it down into like 4 different buckets. Clearly, service providers that I talked about, and it's not just MNOs, but it's actually MSOs, satellite providers, ISPs. And so it's actually pretty diverse in that sense. In terms of technology partners, it's not just folks from the established tier 1s, but we also have pretty nimble partners that are building solutions, whether it's tier 2 vendors, whether it's silicon players. All of them are part of this, and we have research institutes working together with us as well. And the reason that they're incentivized is because they want their research to actually translate to ultimate products at the end. Another key component of this community is the system integrator community. As you think about virtualized and disaggregated solutions, the reality is you need that critical glue to stitch together these solutions to offer it to operators. So the system integrators are a really crucial part of this ecosystem, and they're playing a key role. And ultimately, if you think about it, for these solutions to get deployed on street furniture, on city assets, you really want to make sure that you have the municipalities, you have all of the communities, including the enterprises and other internet companies, part of your ecosystem. So that's why it's really important to make sure that you really are looking at all facets of the problem statement and making sure that every aspect of that is covered and you have the community engagement. So moving to kind of the channels for collaboration, the first thing I want to highlight is the project groups, right? This is where we actually get the hardware partners, the software partners, and most importantly, the operators defining the problem statements to make sure that we are actually architecting and building a solution of essence. And the 3 areas that I talked about earlier, access, backhaul, and core, we have project groups that fall in each one of these 3. We have a number of them that I'll talk about later in this presentation. But that's where the real work around defining the specification, actually doing the early prototyping, bringing stuff into kind of the validation stage really happens. And then you get into the community labs, and that's where you start doing the integration and start making sure that the solutions that you've defined in the project groups can be validated, they meet the operator expectations. And ultimately, we start moving towards deployments, right? And making sure that the operators can run field trials and have early deployments, and not only do that for themselves, but ultimately share the results of those with the community. Because we want it to be such that every operator doesn't do this in a silo. Ultimately, they share the common lessons learned with the rest of the community so that people can move faster by learning from each other. And this problem is fairly obvious when you think about new technologies, right? If you think about millimeter wave, or you think about an SDN-based approach to build an optical transponder, a lot of the operational teams don't really fully understand what it takes to make this work. So being able to share playbooks coming out of the early trials and deployments is important so that others can learn from it and be convinced that this is something that's fairly easy to do, and you can save time and money ultimately from an operator standpoint. A little bit about the TIP ecosystem acceleration centers. These are ways and means of bringing the startup community to work very closely with the telecom operator community with the support of the actual investor base. Right, so really think of this as a triangle where you have operators, you have startups, and you have investors really working together to accelerate innovation in this space. And this is done through actually having a pretty solid vetting process where the operators actually evaluate a whole bunch of startups. They see whether they meet their needs. They actually go through that selection process. Ultimately, they create a path for these startups to work together with the operator to architect a solution and create a path to commercialization. If you think about the actual companies themselves, they are incentivized to make sure that this is successful, because if the startup is able to prove to an operator that there's a path to commercialize this, other operators will see this as well. And from an investor perspective, they have the close eye on these startups that are actually working closely with these operators. And so they can see the proof points. They can see, hey, are these trials turning out to be successful? Should we continue to invest for the longer term, right? So that's why this effort is really crucial within TIP as well. So I'm going to talk very little about how we work, which has actually kind of been a question mark that we get from a lot of people. I specifically want to talk about the licensing structure. TIP actually has a very flexible licensing structure. And the reason I want to highlight that is we support both open source as well as RAND-based approaches. And so typically, this is important to discuss because some of the partners in this industry want to go down the path of being fully open source. And some partners are actually heavily dependent on revenue that comes from licensing and so on. So they might want to be more inclined towards working in the RAND space. So we support both modus operandi. We want to make sure that people can work and build solutions dependent on the type of mechanism that is chosen for a project group. In terms of like diverse membership, right? Clearly, we have members coming from different types of companies, whether it's established tier 1 operators, whether it's tier 2, whether it's vendors that are representing different parts of the ecosystem. It's really diverse in that sense. And in terms of like making sure people are engaged, really focusing on workshops that bring that community together on specific topics is something that we've actually actively encouraged. And we've done that numerous times, whether we did that in Berlin with the support of Deutsche Telekom, which is really a millimeter wave workshop. We've done that in the Asia-Pacific region for a couple of key areas, and we did that in Latin America as well. So the idea is that to identify from the operator community in that region, what is really important to you, right? What are the technologies and what are the problem statements that you have that we can work together to bring solutions forward? So I talked a little bit about the 3 different areas that TIP is invested in. I'm going to talk a little bit about the access project groups. As you can see on this slide, we have 4 different RAN project groups. So we have Open RAN, Virtualized RAN Front Haul, the Open RAN 5G NR, and Open Cellular. So these are the 4 project groups that are radio access network focused. We have an effort in the Wi-Fi space. That's also an access program. And then we have a crowd cell effort, which is a repeater effort that we've incubated within the access domain. And then we have 2 programs that are edge computing related, one which is more focused on infrastructure, and one that's more focused on defining APIs to actually leverage the edge computing infrastructure itself. Moving to the backhaul space, we have a millimeter wave networks project group that I mentioned earlier. We have a project group in the microwave space that's focused on redefining what you can do with an access agnostic microwave solution and how you can make that band independent. And ultimately, the Open Optical Packet Transport group that includes a number of initiatives focused on cell-side gateways, optical transponders, open line systems, and so on. And moving to the core space, we have 2 programs, the end-to-end network slicing program and then the AI and machine learning program. And these are at different stages of maturity, working on applying principles of edge of network slicing to late 4G, and then moving to 5G, and then AI and machine learning being applied to a couple of different areas, radio access, Wi-Fi, and so on. So I'm going to take a little bit of a zoom-in approach right now, just trying to give you an example of some of the key project groups so that you get a sense of how we've actually achieved success. If you take the example of the Open RAN project group, this was launched in 2017 at the TIP Summit. And the idea was to bring some of the key operators together to define requirements for what open radio access network should be all about, right? Making sure that from a community standpoint, we're hearing from the operators, what is the kind of solutions they're looking for? Are they looking for general purpose processor-based solutions? Are they looking for virtualization benefits? Are they looking for disaggregation of hardware and software? How do you bring all of those requirements in? How do you synthesize them to make sure that there's a clear set of requirements that go to the community? And so we had these operators actually issue the first set of RFIs. And so Vodafone and Telefonica issued the first RFIs in 2018. In June, thereafter, at 2018 in October, they basically collected all of the RFI results coming from all the different vendors, synthesized it, and they actually shared this with the rest of the community. So the advantage of this was that the community heard from some of the key tier 1 operators who's best of breed in hardware, who's best of breed in software, who's the best system integrator partner, who's providing the best stacks. And this was shared back with the community so that the community can determine for itself, like, what are the kinds of partners they want to work with. But they didn't stop right there. They moved to the next level in terms of like saying, hey, we've done the RFIs, we've picked partners that we believe in for specific areas, but now we're going to do trials. So in 2019, these operators such as Vodafone have been actually doing trials. the first set of trials underway in Turkey with the Open RAN partners, and now actually defining trials in other parts of the globe with announcements coming soon. And so here you can see a couple of examples of the operator partners and then the system vendor partners that are working closely together to really reinvent the RAN space. Shifting gears to the Open Optical Packet Transport group, specifically within that, we have an effort focused on disaggregated cell-site gateways. So for folks that might not be familiar with this, at every single base station site, you have a cell-site gateway. The cell-site gateway is essentially a router and an aggregator of sorts, right? This needs to support layer 2 and layer 3 capabilities and is fairly ubiquitous in any operator network. So the idea was, how could we bring together a solution that applies the principles of SDN, applies the principles of hardware-software disaggregation, and actually incubate a hardware solution with software coming from off-the-shelf partners. So at the outset, the project group created a subgroup for DCSG. Thereafter, we had a couple of key operators, Telefonica, TIM Brazil, Orange, and Vodafone, actually put together a specific set of requirements. So as you can imagine, most of these operators are buying equipment from any one of the established networking vendors. Each one of these solutions has 1,000 protocols supported. Every operator already knows that they don't necessarily need all these 1,000 protocols. They probably need a very small subset of those for these use cases. So being very specific about what are the protocols that are needed, what's the kind of hardware capability you need, what's the memory footprint you need, what kind of conditions are these boxes going to be defined, actually deployed in, being very specific about that so that you created very specific hardware SKUs. That was actually defined in the technical requirements. This was then fed into an RFI process. So the operators then ran an RFI process where they said, based on the specifications that we have defined, we're going to issue RFIs to the vendors and request them to respond with what they can support in terms of hardware and software. Once those were received, these operators then finally published the results with the community. So once again, they identified best-of-breed hardware vendors, best-of-breed software vendors, and then they've taken it to the next level, which is really doing trials with these partners. And so we've had partners doing trials, for example, Vodafone, Telefonica, and TIM Brazil, the 3 key operators, actually doing trials in their own labs with the hardware that's been put together by the hardware vendors, with the software coming from the respective software partners, being integrated and validated in TIP community labs, and giving the operators the confidence that, hey, this thing's as good, if not better, than what I'm buying from my incumbent vendor partners. And that's been kind of the journey for DCSG. And the idea is that once they have confidence in these solutions in the labs, they've started doing production field trials and then moved to scale deployments, entering into 2020. A couple of quick examples of other project groups that we have. The Millimeter Wave Networks project group, is being driven largely through the support of Deutsche Telekom. Their fundamental objective there was to find an alternative to deploying fiber and creating an opportunity for gigabit speeds to be delivered to their customers. And in order to do that, they wanted to work closely together to create the right solution framework, validate these solutions in labs, actually kick off the first field trials that I mentioned in Hungary, validating this with real customers in their homes, being able to receive internet access in the order of 500 megabits to a gigabit, right, using millimeter wave technology that's been created through the program, and then actually deciding to do RFIs and ultimately giving vendors a clear demand signal. If you take the example of the Open RAN 5G in our group, this was just launched at MWC in 2019. It was launched with Sprint, and actually that's supposed to be Vodafone. These 2 operator partners actually kicked off the program with the idea that they wanted to create white box solutions for 5G, both focused on outdoor as well as indoor, and get the vendor partners to come together to meet their requirements. And there are very specific requirements for indoor, very specific requirements for outdoor. This was kind of an effort that was launched based on the successes coming out of the Open RAN 4G effort. Moving to Wi-Fi, this is a new project group, once again launched at MWC in 2019, with the idea of focusing on 3 different areas: mobile data offload, cloud-based Wi-Fi, and ultimately enabling Wi-Fi-based backhaul. Right? So these are the 3 tenets of really this Wi-Fi program, and we have hardware and software vendors working together to meet the needs of the operators. In this case, Deutsche Telekom being one of the key operators that's creating the demand signal for this effort. So in terms of the TIP community labs, I think the most important thing to focus on that is it's really hands-on. Right? We are focused on bringing the partners together to actually integrate in these labs, beat up the solutions, make sure that they actually meet the KPIs that these operators define. Because we would rather that there be a central entity that actually validates this stuff, rather than every single operator have their own validation lab. And this process just takes that much longer. if there can be a common place where you can validate these solutions and these results can be shared with all of the ecosystem partners, then the operators can do very specific tailored tests for their own network, but a majority of those tests can actually be done in a common facility, results can be shared, and the vendors can get the confidence that when they take it to the operator labs, they will have to spend a fraction of the time, which actually allows you to get these disaggregated solutions to market that much faster. In terms of the community labs themselves, I used the term diverse and global before, but this is a slide that really explains what I mean by that. We have labs that started in North America. So we had a lab that was started by Facebook in Menlo Park. Cable Labs actually has a lab facility that they've established in Colorado. In the Latin America region, we have CPQD and TIM Brazil having TIP community labs. If you look at Europe, clearly Deutsche Telekom is a key partner. We had British Telecom set up labs. We had TIM Italy set up a lab. And then if you look at the Asia Pacific region, we had Airtel set up a lab. So it's really operators driving the creation of these labs, the hosting the infrastructure for these labs, and TIP really being the enabler, bringing all of the parties together to build the solutions that can ultimately be deployed. Here's a quick example of a lab. The Virtualized RAN Fronthaul Project Group is one that we've actually invested a lot of effort to leverage different fronthaul interfaces that operators have, whether they have a cable infrastructure, whether they have GFast, whether they have microwave, whether they have E-band. How can you ultimately enable using all those different medium to actually have a centralized RAN or virtualized RAN be proven out? So these are examples of different labs that the operators have set up and are actually validating these solutions and then entering field trials. In a quick example of the millimeter wave labs that Deutsche Telekom set up, they've been actually validating solutions coming out of the work that Facebook's done with Telegraph, proving that millimeter wave can deliver gigabit speeds, can deliver the kind of reliability that they would ultimately expect from fiber, but really leveraging wireless to actually achieve that goal. A topic that I mentioned earlier is the end-to-end demo at MWC 2019. So this was a pretty major effort. As I mentioned earlier, it represented 7 different project groups, 16 different vendors, and had contributions from a number of system integrator partners, component players, hardware, software, and ultimately the operators themselves. And a few quick examples of those are on the slide. You can see actually the rack that we had that actually had all of the server-based processing. The radio heads are not shown in the diagram, but what I really want to highlight is we had radio access, we had backhaul, and we had core solutions end-to-end proven so that an operator could see a complete network being run with TIP-based solutions. And that was the really key intent of an end-to-end demo at MWC. I wanted to talk a little bit about the TIP and ONF collaboration that Timon mentioned right at the outset. If you think about the approach that operators have taken so far, right? Everybody looks at kind of the existing network architecture today. This is really a proprietary NMS, proprietary networking stack, complex closed hardware based on special ASICs, working with custom or potentially a mix of custom and merchant silicon. The world that most of the operators want to move to is really a disaggregated approach, and really enabling open NMS to come in, working along with open SDN, and ultimately looking at disaggregated hardware that works with general purpose processors. That's the ultimate goal, right? That's the shift that all of the operators need to make. And in order to do that, they need support from certification bodies. They need support from the system integrator community. But how can we enable that to happen much faster? If you think about the ONF, right, which is really focused on SDN, which is really focused on open source software, if we can bring that world together with the world that we are focused on within TIP, is to actually develop open hardware as well as use off-the-shelf software as well as open source software. If we can bring those two worlds together, we can actually build solutions that meet operators' needs. And that's the key intent of the collaboration that we are continuing to foster. One quick example of that is the effort that we have on the Open Optical Packet Transport group, right? So this group, as I mentioned earlier, has focused on building open, white box, optical transponders, cell-site gateways, open line systems, and so on. Here's an example of an optical transponder. This is the one that is actually called Cassini, that has been actually contributed by a hardware partner, EdgeCore. So they actually created the hardware reference design. And the idea here was to really take advantage of the ODTN work that's been done within the effort here at ONF, and specifically leverage the ONOS platform so that you can actually configure this entire transponder and look at it from not only configuring the actual optical interfaces, but configuring the control plane, the user plane, and all of that using different approaches. So for example, the transponder abstraction interface allows you to configure the optical modules. You have an OS sitting in the middle that allows you to configure the network ASICs and ultimately enable kind of the SDN approach for a solution of this kind. And this is crucial because for operators to really get the benefits of automation, to get the benefits of actual virtualization, they need to be able to see open source coming in and working with the platforms that they're getting from the hardware community. And this is a perfect example of how TIP and ONF can actually work together and apply, drive innovation in this space. So as I close, I wanted to highlight that there are clearly a number of opportunities for these communities to interact. For anybody to join TIP is fairly easy. There's a link there. In terms of hosting community lab, if there's any service providers in this audience that would like to specifically work within TIP and work along with the ONF and would like to host a community lab, there's a pretty well-defined process to do that. If you're interested in engaging with the TEECs, working together with the startup community, we have a quick, well-defined way to do that as well. And ultimately, the goal is to really drive innovation in an accelerated manner. So with that, I'm just going to mention quickly that we have a TIP Summit coming up later this year. It's in Amsterdam. We'd love to see all of you. If not, if you can't make it, recommend someone else from your organization. We have a great line of speakers, and we'd love to see you actually visit, not only to hear the speakers, but also to see all the demonstrations that we'll have on the show floor. And that would give you a good idea of how we're taking the efforts that we talked about at MWC to the next level. So with that, I'm going to close. Thank you guys for being very patient, listening to me all the way through. If there are any quick questions you guys have, happy to take that.
For clarification, in one of your slides, you had under access, open cellular and crowd cell, but you didn't describe those at all. Instead, you described something that wasn't on that list, referred to as disaggregated cell site. Is disaggregated cell site one of those two, or is it a third?
So the disaggregated cell site gateway is actually a component of the Open Optical Packet Transport Group.
Disaggregated cell site gateway?
Yeah, exactly. It's part of the Open Optical Packet Transport Group, which was, when I talked about the backhaul projects,
so that's part of backhaul?
Yes, that's part of backhaul. That's right.
My other question is on operator membership. As far as I can remember, there are only two in the US, Cable Labs and Sprint. I don't think there are any in India. Can you comment on why that's the case?
So good question. So we have Airtel actually in India that's a TIP member.
Who's the one?
Airtel.
Yeah, but they're very minor. I follow India very closely.
Well, actually, Airtel is one of the three big operators in India at this point. But to your point, yes, we have discussions with other operators as well, ongoing at this time. But Airtel is clearly a very important operator in the region, and they're playing a pretty big role within TIP. So if you have any further questions, I'm happy to take them offline.
I'll take it offline.
Sure.
So you just mentioned you have a project about the open transport network. So my question is that this kind of hardware maybe is easy to build. How about the software?
Great question. Yeah. So the question was, how do you think about software with respect to the Open Optical Packet Transport Group? So we have hardware coming from multiple hardware vendors, and we have software coming from multiple software partners as well. So what we are trying to accomplish is enable two different approaches. One which is partners building predefined software off the shelf that they are able to provide and put on top of the hardware, and also have an open source approach where working along with the ONF, we can foster an approach where open source software can work on top of the same hardware. And there are cases where it's a combination of the two, where somebody could provide an operating system that may be proprietary, but may have open APIs and open interfaces on top to allow for actually better control and more flexibility. So we have all three approaches, fully open source software, ability to use closed source software coming from specific vendor partners, as well as a hybrid approach where it's both closed source as well as open source.
And that closed open source version is actually on demonstration in at least two of the booths in the Expo Center.
So who is actually responsible for pulling all of this together? Is this under your organizations?
Great.
Because it needs to have a project managers to pull all of this together, to integrate the hardware and the software and testing it, right?
So the question is, how do you actually make sure that there's ownership to actually go ahead and integrate? What we try to do is twofold. Make sure that anybody who hosts a TIP community lab, if it's an operator that's hosting a TIP community lab, they have dedicated resources to make sure that the infrastructure is set up, and they've dedicated resources to review the results coming out of that effort, right? Because we want to make sure that any KPIs or whatever that are defined have been carefully reviewed by the operators so that they have the blessing to say, hey, this can actually move to a field trial. And at the same time, there are resources from the TIP community that are actually working as part of this. And then there are a huge number of resources from the ecosystem, whether the system integrator partners, whether it's the hardware vendors, whether it's the software vendors working together. So it is actually a joint ownership effort, but the project management is definitely a function of the operator and the TIP community working together to make sure that happens.
Okay, good. So thank you very much. A round of applause.